All right. So everybody, if you're just joining, welcome. Thanks for sticking around to those who have been here for the duration today. Our next presenter, Kurz, is going to give, I think we're moving from the sort of in-depth, dirty hands version of research to some sharing of very interesting finding and trends, which I think it's really gonna complement quite nicely. So I'm gonna get out of the way, Christian. I'm gonna let you do your thing. I'll circle back for Q&A afterward, but let it rip.
All right, wonderful. Thanks so much, Bill. And hello, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. I would normally say great to see you, but I can't see any of you. So it's good to be here. I hope you can see me. My name is Kurz, and I head up global streaming and corporate insights for Viacom CBS. And what I will be sharing with you today is our latest findings on a project called Beyond 2020. If all works, you should now be seeing my screen. Is that right? Yeah, perfect. Okay. So the idea behind this project is all around understanding young people around the world, what they have done during the year 2020, how that has impacted their life in the short/medium term, but also looking at how their perception of the future has changed or is evolving and continues to do so. So we'll get into all of that. But before that, very quickly, for the three of you who may not know who Viacom CBS are, we are an entertainment company, content first. We pride ourselves on being storytellers, and we do that across all of the audiences and across all of a number of brands, going all the way from young kids, preschool kids with the Nick Jr. Nickelodeon brands, growing up through MTV, Comedy Central, up to CBS, Showtime, and of course, our Paramount Movies studio. On the local side in multiple countries, not just in the US, we have a broadcast network at CBS, we do in the UK with Channel 5, Australia Network 10, Telefe in Argentina. And on top of that, of course, our streaming services, Pluto TV, which is present in a lot of countries already, and Paramount Plus, having recently launched/relaunched around large parts of the world. So we're a global company present around the world, really trying to drive content and content production and then distribute that across a number of platforms, some of which are our own. Our president, Bob Bakish, a while back said this, and this is one of my favorite quotes, not only because it justifies my existence and our team's existence, but I think it's really, really true. And as an organization, we are absolutely striving to live up to this. Research is an inspiration. It's where we begin as a company. It informs our strategies, both business and creative. It shapes our brands, of which we have plenty, inspires our content and our marketing. So we truly try to live up to this. And in order to be able to do this, of course, we need to understand audiences around the world of all ages. Honing in now onto the youth market, we've been doing this for a very, very long time. These are just examples of the youth general audience thought leadership stuff that we've been doing over the last 10 years globally, which really ranges across the board. And some of those may sound familiar to some of you. All of that is now culminating in this year that is 2020, which has changed so much for so many people. And we really wanted to take a fresh look at all of this stuff again and see, right, where are we? Where are people? What do we want to do? What do we need to do? Now, youth, of course, have had very, very eventful lives. I'm not going to go through this because all of this is self-explanatory, and I'm sure most of you know most of these things, but really there's been a lot going on in the lives of young people today overall, and even more so in the year 2020, right? So the year has been bookmarked by wildfires in January in Australia and December in California, and then a whole lot of stuff in between from, of course, that pandemic that we've been talking about, the health pandemic, but also the racism awakening, I guess, for lack of a better word, as well as politics left, right, and center, and an enormous amount of natural disaster as the impact of climate change is coming through, but also the climate change protests that we started 2020 with, like the school strike for climate, all those types of things. There's a lot that's happened in 2020 alone. So in order to reset and rebase, what did we do? We talked to over 8,000 16 to 24-year-olds, so that's our definition of youth in this context, across 15 countries, which you will see lovely highlighted on this map here. We did a global online survey, not surprisingly there, but what we also did is we did remote video interviews with consumers in a number of those markets, or young people in a number of those markets, and then cut that together into a lovely video, which I'll be sharing with you, because it is oftentimes helpful to hear consumers themselves talk about this stuff rather than listening to me portraying what they're saying. We also did some more immersive digital exercises to really try to get to the root, because of course we couldn't get into anyone's home at the end of 2020. In some places, we also have a comparison to 2017, and actually going further back to 2012, where we fielded similar questions in the same countries with a similar age group. So we've got some of those comparisons here where they make sense. Right, starting with 2020, of course, has been defined by disruption, not a surprise to anyone. 82% of our young people say that they have had a lot of plans disrupted in 2020. Now, of course, that's not unique to young people, everybody has. But if you remember, the younger you are, the fewer years your life has been, and therefore the bigger percentage any single year is of your life, and the bigger that weighs on you. 80% also say that 2020 has made me rethink their plans for the future, that's the pivot that we're taking of saying, right, so we're talking about 2020, but really also what does that mean for the mid and long-term future? And we're talking about 5 to 10 years into the future. The stuff that 2020 has changed is not just COVID. Of course, that though is the thing that has changed or impacted people the most. But very, very close to that in a number of markets is this complex of topics around Black Lives Matter, anti-racist movements, the death of George Floyd, and protests against police brutality. So we put that complex of topics together as one thing, and that is the second most impactful, or has been, for 2020. Followed by natural disasters and climate change and the protests around that, then political events, which by definition are largely local, and then we have wars and terrorism. Now, that's the global picture. Not everything impacts equally in every market. And you see, though, very clearly that the COVID pandemic is by far the biggest impact in every one of those markets. But you then see some interesting things emerge beyond that. So the complex around anti-racist movements, obviously the US is high, but the UK and South Africa are really, really high up there as well as a number of other European markets where that is really seen as something that has had a significant impact. Conversely, you look at China and Mexico, natural disasters and climate change things are by far the second one. And in the case of China, very close to the COVID pandemic in terms of what has impacted people. Now, what has all of that done to consumers or to young people? Well, unfortunately, it has made them significantly less happy and quite a bit more stressed. This is one of the most depressing slides that I have ever presented, and every time I look at it, I get shivers down my spine again, because if you look at this in just 8 years, from 2012 to 2020, the levels of happiness among 16 to 24-year-olds have dropped by almost a third, which is crazy. We're now getting to a point of just over half of young people consider themselves to be happy. That is nothing compared to the 70% that we had 8 years ago, or 9 years ago now. At least the levels of stress are not rising in a similar fashion. They're rising a little bit less than that, but still we're going from 36 to 46. That is a third up. So there's a significant change here. Now, what this year has done is clearly not something that is to be sniffed at. There's a lot of stuff that's changed in young people and in young people's lives. And really what we wanted to do is unpack that and say, right, so what's happening next? How do you respond to that, and how do you feel about it? And that brings us to this whole idea of Beyond 2020, which, guess what, is the title of our project. So there is good news. Young people remain positive and remain looking to the future. 90%, over 90% say that they want to make the most of what comes next beyond the year 2020. So that forward-looking spirit absolutely remains and remains unbroken. They do, however, know that it ain't going to be easy. 93% say that they know that they will have to work really hard to achieve their goals. And half of our young people are feeling this even more strongly than they did a year ago. So there is a lot of work, and there is an acknowledgement that there is going to be a lot of work in here, but that's the good thing. Young people are absolutely up for that challenge. Taking all of that into consideration, when we ask people saying, right, what is the things, what are the topics that you think society needs to work on the most? What's the number one priority for society to work on, or society needs over the next 10 years? The number one thing that comes out is the environment, followed by the economy, gender equality, crime and violence, and then systemic racism. And remember, this is in a year where towards the end, or at least in the middle of it, the only topic that you would hear about anywhere is COVID, right? Even in a year where such a massive fundamental thing happened in the world, what young people think is going to be the most important thing over the next 10 years is the environment and climate change and that whole complex of topics. That is telling us there is a fundamental disconnect between how young people and consumers are thinking and what is happening in the world, and actions that are not, I guess, being taken in various ways. Now, again, this breaks down slightly differently for individual countries. So we wanted to visualize that a little bit as well. And you have systemic racism here at the top for the US and the UK. You have the environment at the top for large parts of Europe as well as Australia. And then also you have the economy coming in, particularly in countries where the economies have suffered more, right? So we're looking at China, Latin America, and also parts of Asia where the economy is really high on that. Crime and violence, Argentina and Brazil, very top up here, but also high in some other markets. The US actually is an interesting element here where we see systemic racism at the top, crime and violence number 2, the economy number 3, the environment is number 4. That is the lowest the environment is in any of those markets where the environment makes the top 5 at all. The only places where the environment does not make the top 5 are South Africa and Brazil. So it's interesting to see how the US thinks about some of these topics. And of course, some of that is because some of those topics are simply more important here. But also, I think it speaks to a slightly different approach or attitude towards some of the things that are important or perceived to be important in other markets. So that's for society, for the country as a whole. Now then, we pivoted and said, right, well, what about yourself? What is important to you? And what really comes out here is that for young people in this uncertain world, what they really crave is security and stability. So for themselves, what they're looking for, or the priorities in the next 10 years, are to have a stable job, to keep myself and my loved ones from harm, to be comfortable with who they are, have a strong family unit, and take care of my mental health. And you see some really interesting topics come through. You see health, both physical and mental, cropping up. But really what we're seeing is that this whole idea of the world is uncertain, there's nothing I can control, but what I need for this is, right? So it's almost going back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? I can't strive for self-realization if I don't have a roof over my head, or self-actualization. So really what this is right, times are tough, the world is messy, let's focus in on the things, the stability and the security that I need. And then once I have that, beyond that, I can work on other things. So let's look to the future in that 5 to 10 year horizon of time. What we're hearing from people is that, of course, keeping in touch will absolutely be essential. And doing that in an online world is something that has existed before the year 2020 and is going to continue to be incredibly important. 60% agree that relationships will be mostly kept alive by online connections, and 2/3 say that their friends will live in many countries around the world. So we really are starting to see that world openness come through here, in a digital sense, right? So there's stuff that's coming through that is really exploring this. However, that will not be a substitute for connections in real life. 84% say that spending time with people in person will be as important as it is today / was before COVID. So there is absolutely a yearning for physical connections to come back and to do that. And with that, there is also an expectation that travel is going to bounce back. We're seeing this, or we saw this starting in the US and in some other markets. That may well be dampening again now as more restrictions are coming in place again. But overall, young people are absolutely expecting travel to come back to the same levels as before the pandemic. And part of the reason why is, if you understand, is really logical if you understand why young people travel, right? And this quote from Rosella in Italy is really making that very clear. The more you travel, the more you understand different worlds. I hope to travel as much as possible because I'm hoping to grow more and to try and understand the world more and more. So if you combine that idea earlier with I want to have, or my connection, I'm expecting to have connections with people around the world, this helps me understand those people. So again, it is real life supplementing the digital world and the online connections. So that's travel. Then we're going to work. 16 to 24-year-olds work as well, as do we all. And there is an absolute acknowledgement or acceptance that work is going to continue to undergo dramatic transformation over the next few years. Remote and flexible working will be the norm. 80% of young people around all of those countries agree with that statement. AI and automation will have replaced many jobs in 10 years' time. There's also an acknowledgement of that. So again, that harks back to this desire to have a more secure and more stable environment that I can live in, that I can work around. And then on top of that, more people will want to work in a role that helps people. Now, this is very clearly an impact of the pandemic. How long that is going to last remains a question, because we are seeing now that healthcare professionals, educators, all of those professions that have really been at the front lines of what it is and that do help people are not really being valued as much as we would have all expected them to, right? The pay rises are not coming through, essentially, if you want to do that, if you want to look at it that way. And on top of all of that, what 2020 has also done is it has put health on the radar of young people. And there's one quote in the video that you'll see. There's a guy from Italy who's talking about, in 2020, we realized that from one day to the next, our health may be in jeopardy in a way that nobody has thought of before. And that is something that's incredibly important to young people now, both in the physical sense, but also the mental health that is at the forefront. And we're seeing this playing out at the Olympics, to just name a couple of examples, where we're seeing that focus on mental health is something that is going to absolutely remain and be important, and be more important than it was ever before. Looking into that mental health topic a little bit more, what we're seeing is that 3/4 of our young people say that in 10 years' time, mental health will be a major problem for society. So it's absolutely not going to be solved in 10 years' time. It's something that will be a problem. However, they also think that there will be more openness and acceptance of mental health issues across society. And what that's led to is that even today, 41% have taken part in a conversation about mental health as a result of the events of 2020. So what 2020 has really done is it has brought mental health to the forefront of people's minds. Pivoting slightly to politics, young people expect accountability and diversity in their leaders. So 3/4 agree that governments and politicians will be held more accountable for their actions. And just under that, agree with the statement that politicians governing their country will be from a more diverse range of backgrounds than they are today. However, unfortunately, they are realistic and they're not expecting very much to change. 3/4 think that corruption is still going to be a problem in their country in 10 years' time. And just under 2/3 say that nothing much will have changed in politics. So while they have these hopes and aspirations and they're absolutely expect things to change on the surface, the underlying outcome, they're still somewhat skeptical about. And they very much understand overall that the responsibility for the future lies in their hands. 82% say that everyone will be expected to educate themselves about social issues. And 80% will be actively involved in creating a society of equality in the future. So they are aware of and looking to actually play their part and do what they think society needs. With that, they absolutely expect brands and companies to join them in that mission. Today, 83% think that already I expect brands to stand up against social injustice. And we have seen that in the past year that a lot of brands have, some of them unfortunately only in the short term. But what we're also seeing is that in the future, just under 80% of them agree that brands will take even more of a stand against social injustice. So it's high today. The expectation is for that to become even more and even higher. And really that is something that all of us certainly as Viacom CBS, but all of your companies as well, really need to think about and say, right, how do we play within that? And I'll give a few examples at the end of the presentation of how people are actively trying to do that. So all in all, youth believe that they have the power to change the world. 84% agree that their generation has the potential to change the world for the better. That is in itself not really a very meaningful number. Those numbers exist around the world. What I find, have existed for oodles of time. What I find really, really interesting is that even in a year of 2020, that has not changed, right? They believe that they have the power to change the world and are absolutely positively strong-willed and minded to make that happen. And with that, I'm going to play that video, but I have to make sure that I share the sound first. There we go. So you'll now hear from young people around the world in their own words. And then I'll come back and give a few more examples of how some companies are already acting on some of these recommendations. And we'll look at all of that together. So with that, enjoy this video.
"2020, it's been a challenging year, from the ongoing global pandemic to police brutality and systemic racism sparking protests in cities around the world, to disasters caused by climate change and activism around the environment. This year has brought a huge amount of change, disruption and uncertainty on a truly global scale. At this pivotal moment in history, we wanted to check in with young people aged between 16 and 24. We did this through a global survey across 15 countries, together with remote video interviews with young people around the world.
Ciao a tutti, mi chiamo Rossella, ho 19 anni.
My name is Tyler.
Sono Mattia.
So my name is Chelsea.
My name is Callum.
How has this period of change and uncertainty affected youth? What are their hopes and dreams for the future? And how are the events of today shaping young people's plans, beliefs and attitudes for tomorrow, beyond 2020? Clearly, the COVID-19 pandemic has played a huge role in the disruption of 2020.
I think it's kind of been the most challenging year ever.
Ik vind het wel een heftig jaar, dus wat er gebeurt.
Coronavirus has been the biggest event by far, just because it stopped everything in its tracks. And then I think that event led us to re-examine a lot of other issues that we're dealing with as a society in the world right now.
The pandemic has changed lives, but for some, it also offered a rare chance to reflect and reassess.
Nessa quarentena, a nossa cabeça fica mil, a nossa mente fica mil. E aí o que você mais quer, às vezes, é ir para uma cachoeira, ou ir para uma praia, ou viajar para outros lugares, respirar um pouco, e aí não pode.
2020 just made me like look at myself and just really like do the work on myself to like when I come out here and just be a better person, like for me, not even for anybody else, but just for me and focus on me and like actually slow down.
Proprio come nazione, come cittadino, in primis io voglio cercare di cambiare, quindi speranza in senso positivo.
Following the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and many others, the Black Lives Matter and anti-racism movements have had a huge impact, and not just in the United States, but around the world.
I feel like the Black Lives Matter movement is really, really important. I really do hope that it creates change, even in Australia, you know, for like indigenous rights as well. You know, there are so many deaths in custody.
Minha participação nesse movimento, ela se limitou ao online. Eu me posicionei bastante em conversas, em redes sociais, mas não tanto no presencial.
I mean, I've always been, I feel like, part of it, but I feel like I never knew how to like actively contribute as much as I wanted to.
I do a lot of social media activism, trying to spread the word, petitions. That for me has been the biggest part of my year, and it's been really inspiring to see everyone kind of coming together over it.
And globally, other events, including climate change protests, natural disasters and political turmoil, have taken their toll too.
So I definitely feel passionate about the climate change issue. I feel a lot of anger towards our government in terms of how little they've been doing in the past and how little they're doing at the moment.
Quindi dobbiamo cominciare a cambiare effettivamente qualcosa, perché sennò poi davvero ci ritroveremo in una situazione, secondo me, che poi non sarà più tanto ma poi faremo, sarà troppo tardi poi, e noi dobbiamo evitare all'arrivare a una situazione simile.
The biggest thing is like just politics everywhere. Like I've heard it now more than I ever have in my life.
2020 has clearly been a challenging year, prompting change, reflection and reassessment. But how does this impact youth beyond 2020? Young people know they'll have to work hard to achieve their personal goals and crave stability in an uncertain world. But overall, they remain resilient and confident.
Yeah, I feel like stability is something that we're all like kind of searching for right now. I don't know if my life can just fall apart all at once.
Ai, espero estar viajando muito. Espero estar com uma vida financeiramente bem, falando assim. Acho que todo mundo quer, né?
Oh, I'm ready to get on a plane. I'm ready to go travel. I feel trapped. Like it's making me depressed at times. You know, it's making me a little like, I can't do this.
Ja, geestelijk merk ik wel gewoon, vooral de laatste maanden, dat diep gezondheid belangrijker is dan je lichamelijke gezondheid.
I feel like I'm more invested in putting my physical and mental health before anything else now.
Secondo me si è un attimo fermati, si è entrato in contatto su come appunto la nostra salute può da un giorno all'altro essere fragile.
When it comes to wider issues, youth are optimistic for change, but are aware that it won't come easily.
Eu acho que em 10 anos essa questão racial vai ter mudado bastante, principalmente no Brasil. Non un fim do razzismo, ma una grande amenizazione dele.
Sicuramente porterà qualcosa di positivo e a dei cambiamenti, anche se non penso a breve termine, cioè no, a breve termine, non penso in un breve periodo, insomma. Cioè penso che ci voglia tanto tempo, come diciamo ci è voluto e sono iniziati insomma tanto tempo fa questi movimenti.
I think that the political issues that we are suffering with and dealing with now, I think we've dealt with them for forever. I'm not sure that there's going to be a major change in what we're dealing with.
I feel like in the next 10 years, we just kind of have to, everyone just needs to get their shit together, honestly. Like, we just have to figure something out.
They have a lot to think about, but despite the unprecedented events of 2020, youth today still believe they have the power to change the world and are excited about the future.
So if I had to describe the future,
Dovessi descrivere il futuro,
Se eu tivesse que escrever o futuro
In 3 words.
in 3 words.
In 3 woorden.
If I have to describe the future in 3 words, it would be
daunting,
Scary,
Worrying,
política,
Mistério.
Different.
ambitie, nuove idee,
accepting,
exciting,
Kansrijk.
Novità,
amor,
Loving.
positivo,
Freeing.
progressive,
optimistic.
crescita,
sustainable.
Caring.
Wel divers.
All right, well, I hope you enjoyed that. And with that, going straight from what young people are saying themselves to, well, what do we do about it? So what? And where we got to that is that really we found 3 main takeaways that are important for all of us to keep in mind. and that is adapt, facilitate, and inspire. And I'm going to go through each of them in a bit more detail and give some examples of what we mean by those. Starting with adapt, where all of us, both of course within Viacom CBS, as well as all of our commercial partners and everybody in general, needs to adapt for the future. And we need to do that now. Our future plans should help provide the stability that young people crave and make meaningful commitments to drive positive change around social issues. Businesses and brands take a long time to build and even longer to steer a tanker in a different direction. So what we need to be doing is we need to be thinking about our next steps and the path ahead today, just as youth are thinking about theirs. Investment and initiatives shouldn't be short-term reactions that look for quick fixes. They should instead be part of a long-term plan. When thinking about the future, we need to keep young people's best interest for a stable future at heart and make long-term, genuine commitments around the issues that they care about. And it's also important to communicate these plans with consumers and maintain a consistent ethos, both internally and externally. And don't get me wrong, you can only communicate something once it is really implemented and you're living that truth before you communicate it, but the communication of it is important as well. So a few examples. As we've seen, young people are looking to brands to drive positive change for the environment and on other social issues. This example here is Apple and their very specific climate change promise. They've made a public promise that all of their products will be carbon neutral by 2030. And some brands, in addition to that, are going even further by aiming to be carbon negative and actually give back to the environment. One of those brands, as an example, is the British, or actually Scottish brewing company Brewdog. Now, there's also been some controversy about them lately, but I think this spot is actually really, really interesting in how they communicate that commitment to carbon negativity.
Science is clear. We're facing a climate crisis. Huge change is needed right now.
And that is why Brewdog is now carbon negative.
Every single year, we're going to pull twice as much carbon out of the air as we emit.
Our carbon, our problem.
So we're going to fix it ourselves right here.
We've bought this beautiful 2,000-acre chunk of Scottish Highlands to create the Brewdog Forest.
And we're going to plant 1 million trees to pull carbon out of the air. The site that we bought for our own forest extends 5 kilometres that way and almost 7 kilometres that way.
This all means that by drinking Brewdog beer, you're having a positive impact on the planet.
Together, let's make Earth great again.
Drink punk,
kill carbon.
So that was just one example. Ben & Jerry's are also a brand who have publicly taken a stand for the issues that they believe in, and they've done that for many years, to the extent that they even have an Issues We Care About section on their own website. One of their most recent initiatives is an ice cream flavor that's called Justice Remixed, the proceeds of which contribute towards criminal justice reform in the US. So that's just one other example. So then we're moving on to facilitate. That's the second recommendation, and brands really should act as facilitators for young people to help them achieve the change that they're looking for and also to have fun. Youth today want to change the world for the better, but they don't necessarily know where to start, and they certainly know that it won't be easy. Brands can facilitate young people's desire for learning and positive change by providing guidance and resources, for example, around mental health and social issues. This is going to enable young people to achieve the change that they want to see. And then at the same time, young people also need to let loose. It's been a very, very difficult 18 months, and young people have been under a lot of pressure, and there's potentially more changes to come. So providing an escape for young people to let loose is also important. And they want to have fun, but not just on Zoom, but in person too, because we did see that having actual relationships with people in person is also key. So a couple of examples here. This is one from ourselves, from Viacom CBS, showing how MTV has supported young people during this difficult time and are enabling youth to make positive change. The MTV Generation Change content that's pictured here is geared towards life under lockdown and focuses on providing information as well as guidance on how people can take action. These are short form videos that cover a range of topics, including the environment, mental health, and equality. So that's just one of the things that we've done to try and help. In terms of helping young people to have fun, both of these examples that are on this slide do happen in the virtual space. Fortnite, Party Royale, those are events that are a great example of how our digital platform has taken advantage of lockdowns to provide interactive experiences that replicate real-world festival fun. And we should expect a lot more of that as we are slowly moving to the metaverse of where all of this stuff is going to happen. Another example of an event that allowed people to just let loose and have fun during the quarantine period was the Lady Gaga fundraiser, where it was all about tied into Gaga's album launch. And it was trying to give an authentic nightlife feel that obviously was unachievable or unattainable for so many at that point. And lastly, we also have Inspire. Brands absolutely can inspire young people to be able to face and overcome their own challenges through sharing stories of triumph against adversity. And in addition, we can also inspire young people by helping them to explore their interests in travel and culture. As we've seen, young people feel that they will now have to work even harder to achieve their goals, but they are looking towards an uncertain future with hope. We can look to great achievements and journeys of struggle, progress, and triumph in our storytelling to help inspire young people as they navigate challenges ahead. These stories can also inspire openness around identity, self-discovery, and mental health. And of course, telling stories is our bread and butter as an entertainment company, but every commercial, every ad that is being created is a story and can tie into those. And we'll show one in a minute. And then, of course, brands can also tap into young people's appetite for travel and experiencing different cultures. Content in this space can help to inspire their own future travel, provide insight into places that they may not be able to visit in person, and also show the diversity of the world that we know they want to see more of. So a couple of examples here. My favorite one from last year is window swap. It's a very, very simple thing. It allows you to get the feeling of being somewhere else in the world by seeing through somebody else's window out onto the street or nature or whatever that is. It provides a network of webcams or uploaded videos that you can randomly be associated with, and it just helps. It's a great tool for mental health. The other one on here is Trippin', which is a travel platform at the intersection of community, creativity, and culture, which describes itself as connecting cultures worldwide. The site features travel guides involving musicians and influencers. For example, in the screenshot here, you can get tips on things to do and places to go in Kingston with Sean Paul, as well as a guide to Black-owned businesses in Sydney. So those are just two examples. The last one, and I'm going to play this, is an ad from Coca-Cola, which shows how we've all been going through very similar experiences wherever we are around the world. It is a really interesting look at the similarities that bind us together, regardless of where in the world we live. But it also celebrates and gives a glimpse into a range of cultural diverse settings and just makes you feel positive and expect a positive outcome when all of this is over.
The day the world stopped was the day we found where to go. Lost together, we discovered ourselves again. And we realized that the things that matter deserve time.
That looks good.
For two.
from now on, we're not going to leave anything on our plates. Because we've learned to savor the moments that were always there. And they never tasted this good.
All right, that one, if you really think about it, gets you every time. So now 2 more slides of recap, and then we'll do a bit of Q&A. So please get your questions ready. Feel free to type them into the Q&A section or the chat, and we'll get to some of them in a bit. So to recap, 2020 has been a really, really challenging year, but young people are optimistic and they see themselves as being part of a better world in future as a result. The events of this year have prompted a desire for stability and a feeling that they will need to work harder than ever to achieve those goals. And while the future remains very uncertain and becomes more uncertain by the day, young people are excited and eager to make the most of what comes next. So what that means for us as well is that climate change should absolutely be very high on the agenda. That young people think that that should be the top of the agenda, as a matter of fact. Health and mental health especially also need increased attention and support. Young people want to continue to educate themselves on social issues to help make the change, and they expect the same from everybody else around them. With a lack of confidence in governments, young people are more and more looking to brands and companies to help make that difference. And they want to be able to experience and immerse themselves in other cultures again. As we saw, they are most excited about this in terms of travel, but this appetite can also be tapped in many, many other ways. Now, with that, thank you very much for your attention. If you're interested, there is more about this on our blog at insights.viacomcbs.com. And I now look forward to looking at any questions you may have put in here. So let me open that up. No questions at this point, but I can agree with what's in the chat that the philosophical gap between youth and age 50 plus has never been wider. So it is something that is certainly very interesting as well. And welcome back, Bill.
Hey, now, Christian, we do have a couple of questions that came in on YouTube. So
all right.
I'll read those out to you. You don't have access to those. One was from John, and it's, have all the questions in the survey been the same each time it has been run? Have you seen any questions? Have you added any questions specifically for the events that occurred in 2020?
So yes, is the short answer. We've added an awful lot. So much so that we can actually only trend a small number of questions, namely the happiness and stress questions. So wherever I've showed progression over time, those questions were exactly the same. And we even, I think it was 16 countries this time, it was only 14 countries in 2012. So we've even taken those 2 countries out that we've added to make it a like-for-like comparison. But really this year, we looked at this in a very, very different way. So we started from scratch and really started to dig deep into the question wording and the adjustment to what really has happened in life. So yeah, this is actually quite different from what we've done in the past.
And I'll piggyback on that. Looking beyond 2020, see what I did there? Future waves. Is there, I'm sure the gears are always turning, but are there things that you're sort of looking forward to, including in upcoming?
Yes, of course, always. I mean, yes, you can see them turning, right? So the most interesting, or actually, it's actually quite depressing, but we did, so Australia, as many of you know, have had until very recently a relatively good run in controlling COVID and managing for that. So much so that in the beginning of this year, like February-ish, we went into field in Australia with something that we tentatively called Beyond 2020, because we wanted to understand how do people in Australia, in a market where normality really seemed to be in very close grasp, how are they looking for it? We were looking at that to hopefully provide us a template of what might happen in other parts of the world. That research is finished. Unfortunately, now Australia is going very quickly, very backwards. in all of this. So we're sitting on it. We're still looking to roll this out at a marketing conference in Australia, I think in July, August, like now-ish. But unfortunately, it is no longer as true, or certainly no longer, well, certainly not as true for Australia, but it could still be a directional information for us for the rest of the world. So we are essentially waiting until, I don't know that there's ever going to be an after, like a point at which, you know, this is going to be over. But as we are approaching some sort of normality, whenever that happens, really the interesting thing is, right, so what does that mean for now? And that is interesting for young people. But also what we're working on right now actually is looking at, at kids, so 6 to 12-year-olds, saying, right, for them, these past 18 months have been an even bigger chunk of their life. So what does the world look like to kids? That's one of the things that we're focusing on now. We'll look at younger adults again in the near future as well. So there's loads of questions out there.
And the next question is from Rachel, and she asks, how important do you think authenticity and tone in company messaging, especially directed at younger generations, will be going forward?
How important what? Sorry, can you repeat the first part of that?
Authenticity and tone in company messaging.
Yeah, no, I think authenticity is incredibly important because young people have an incredibly well-honed bullshit meter. And that's really where authenticity is coming from. You can't say things that you cannot absolutely live up to. It is incredibly transparent to young people. And on top of that, they will also hold you to account if that's what you're trying to do. So authenticity is, but what that means for a lot of companies is first you got to figure out who you are and what you're doing, what is authentic to you, and then you can start communicating to that. So you look at Patagonia, for example, as one of the brands that is incredibly authentic in what they do and how they do it and how they fight for climate. And their communication around it. Like that's an example of how you can start looking at that. The tone is the other thing. And tone is a very different thing, because this is where actually it'll be interesting to see how people of different ages, generations, whatever it is, react to tone differently. And I always find that really interesting when I'm browsing through TikTok, which, you know, is a certain thing where there are things that are just not matching up. Like you really have to craft your messaging very carefully. You have to be much more careful on who you're trying to reach, what you're trying to say, and then craft that message individually. So the time of, oh, here's my one message that goes for everybody, the broadcast message, well and truly not really the only thing anymore. You need to at least augment that with much more tailored and specific pieces within that.
And I know you shared some examples of brands that are doing this well, right? Did that exploration bring you across some that are maybe missing the mark? You know, we've got the shining examples on one hand, and you don't have to name names, but if there are any that you've noticed along those lines that are kind of falling short.
I think there's loads of them, and there's actually too many to mention. But one example that I do find really, really interesting, because it's doing so many things so incredibly well and still getting bits wrong. And I am going to call them out on that, because we've seen this over the last few years, is Nike, right? Nike is doing a lot of things incredibly well. And there's the whole Colin Kaepernick messaging, all of that type of stuff. And that's where authenticity then becomes important, because at the same time, they're being called out for having all sorts of people of color making their shoes under minimum wage. So it's that divergence there. Same thing, they're standing up for the Williams sisters and sports athletes and female empowerment, all that stuff, yet they're not paying their athletes when they're on maternity leave. So it's all of those things. You really have to think about this holistically. And by the way, none of this was me finding it. This was people talking about it. So this is just us listening. You really have to think about this very carefully and holistically of, am I in a position to say this? And then how do I position it and how do I message it?
Let's see, we've got another question from Brett. You mentioned that the US, UK, Brazil, and South Africa had some significant differences in some ways from other markets. Can you speak to some of the key differences that you saw among global markets?
Yeah, so there's two things that were going on. One is, of course, we fielded this online survey at one point. At that very point, the status of COVID was very different in very different markets. So we saw somewhat different responses and thoughts about the COVID situation at the time. So that's one thing, but that's merely a matter of time, right? Just like we're counting, I don't know what wave we're counting in the US now, but in country X, we're in wave 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7. So that was one thing that kind of influenced. But the other thing that was very interesting, was very clear, was that what is important to people in terms of society. So the things that I found particularly interesting was that the Black Lives Matter complex, of course, originated in the US, was incredibly important in the US, and resonated not only in international markets with large populations of people of color, but also in some others. You look at some of the more northern continental European markets where the population, let's face it, is still largely white, you started to see references there. What Australia did with that topic is also really interesting because it was fundamentally translated to Australia's First People and Aboriginal rights. And again, people of color in that way, but in a slightly different thing. So those were differences that we saw. But the biggest thing was just that the environment was so important to so many people in so many countries that it even trumped COVID in a lot of places. And a lot of that, I mean, we knew the fact that the environment is incredibly important in China is not a new thing, partly driven by the fact that it is under even more threat than in most other markets, or at least most Western countries. And there's food safety issues and always have been. And there's along with that, all of those things are incredibly important. And the uniformity in those topics was actually really interesting to learn.
Awesome.
All righty.
One last share. I think that's it. So we'll, I hear some stomachs growling, so we'll give everybody a few minutes to go grab a bite. But yeah, this was great, Christian. And from a personal standpoint, I learned the fact that I can drink beer and improve my carbon footprint. I can offset. So this is fantastic.
Yeah, you just have to import that beer, I think. But
yeah, that's true. There we could.
We'll figure something else.
I'm taking it at face value.
But yeah, thank you so much. It was really good to do this, and happy to engage any further. If anybody has any follow-up questions, just get in touch. Insights.viacomcds.com. All right, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.